The Japanese stronghold on Bougainville, ominously dubbed the Hornet's Nest, was a fortress unlike any other. It was a deeply fortified network of bunkers and defensive positions, constructed with such care and precision that it could shrug off even the heaviest bombardments. Artillery shells, which would have reduced lesser fortifications to rubble, had almost no effect here. The Japanese had engineered the site to be virtually immune to outside assault. Above ground, the entire area was so skillfully camouflaged that it blended seamlessly into the surrounding jungle, making it nearly invisible to aircraft. From the sky, it appeared untouched and silent. But below the canopy, it was a death trap, one lined with interlocking fields of fire. Every approach was covered. Every path led into a kill zone. Any infantry brave enough to move toward it was met with a hail of bullets from overlapping positions. The moment they stepped into the open, they were cut down with ruthless efficiency. This kind of position couldn't be taken by ordinary means. The United States military needed a solution, something that could withstand the intense gunfire, keep moving under pressure, and deliver punishing force into even the most concealed enemy hideouts. Bombs and bullets alone were not enough. The Japanese defenders were deeply dug in, protected by steel and earth, and unwilling to give an inch without a brutal fight. The terrain and the tactics demanded something new, something terrifying, and something unstoppable. On January 30th, 1944, 5 modified M3A1 Stuart light tanks rolled slowly toward the Hornet's Nest. These were not ordinary combat vehicles. Instead of carrying high explosive shells or machine gun rounds, they had been refitted with a very different kind of weapon, one that turned the enemy's carefully built defensive system into a liability. Inside their armored hulls, these tanks carried flamethrowers. Their purpose wasn't just to kill, but to flush, burn, and terrorize. The flames they produced crawled into crevices, spread through tunnels, and turned enclosed bunkers into ovens. To the Japanese soldiers inside, these previously secure hiding places became death chambers. The psychological shock of fire was often as destructive as the flames themselves. It was brutal, inescapable, and deeply feared. Even so, these flamethrower tanks posed great danger, not only to those they targeted, but also to the crews inside. If the tanks were hit or malfunctioned, the consequences could be catastrophic. When the United States entered World War II, it had little interest or preparation for fighting a large-scale conflict overseas. As a result, it found itself lagging behind in several critical areas of military technology. One of these was the development of the flamethrower. While Japan and Germany had already integrated these weapons into their armed forces, the United States was only beginning to explore their potential. Reports from the Pacific began to describe horrific close quarters fighting in jungles, caves, and underground complexes. Standard weapons were proving ineffective in these environments. Troops often had to clear out enemy positions one step at a time, with grenades and bayonets, taking heavy losses along the way. In response to this grim reality, the U.S. military urgently began developing its own version of the flamethrower. The outcome of this effort was the M1 flamethrower, which made its first appearance in 1941. It was designed to be carried on a soldier's back, relatively small and lightweight compared to other heavy weapons. The concept was straightforward. Use fire as a tool of destruction and intimidation. 2 tanks filled with gasoline were strapped to the operator's back, connected to a compressed nitrogen canister to provide pressure. A hose led to a wand-like weapon with a nozzle and an ignition system at the tip. With a pull of the trigger, the operator could unleash a stream of burning fuel up to 20 yards ahead, effectively bathing enemy positions in fire. On paper, the M1 was a simple and powerful weapon. But in combat, it quickly became clear that it had significant flaws. The ignition system was fragile and unreliable. It used either an electric spark or a small pilot flame to ignite the fuel. But both methods were prone to failure, especially in the wet, windy, or humid conditions typical of the Pacific Islands. Soldiers were known to carry cigarette lighters as backup, hoping to get the device working in the middle of battle. Fuel delivery was inconsistent, often sputtering or stopping altogether, and the nitrogen tanks couldn't always maintain proper pressure. Sometimes the weapon failed to fire. Other times it erupted dangerously, risking the lives of its own operators. And then there was the danger of simply being seen. The M1 flamethrower, fully loaded, weighed over 60 pounds. Its bulk slowed the user down, made them stand out on the battlefield, and turned them into immediate targets. The Japanese recognized the threat these flame troops posed and prioritized them for elimination. Being a flamethrower operator meant carrying one of the most feared weapons of the war, while also becoming one of the most hunted men on the field. Worse still, if the tanks on their back were hit by gunfire or shrapnel, the results could be horrific. Despite these dangers, the weapon showed promise. The enemy often used complex cave networks, heavily reinforced bunkers, and thick jungle foliage to avoid detection and maintain control of key terrain. Airstrikes and artillery, while powerful, couldn't always reach into these hidden defenses. The flamethrower could. Fire crept into holes and cracks, raced through tunnels, and forced enemy soldiers out, or killed them where they hid. Flames didn't need a direct hit to do damage. The heat, smoke, and terror it brought often did the job without a single bullet fired. The challenge then became clear: how to harness the terrifying power of fire while shielding the soldier who delivered it. The idea of mounting flamethrowers onto armored vehicles emerged as a logical next step. The operator would no longer be exposed, and the vehicle's armor would offer protection while bringing the flamethrower closer to the enemy's strongest positions. The psychological impact would also be magnified. An armored machine rolling forward through gunfire, spraying flames, and withstanding hits would be an unstoppable force on the battlefield. In the late summer of 1943, during training exercises for flamethrower troops on the island of New Caledonia, an officer in the 754th Tank Battalion proposed a concept that would dramatically change how tanks were used in the Pacific Theater. His idea was to take the existing M1 flamethrower and integrate it into a tank chassis, turning it into a mobile, protected platform for delivering firepower where it was needed most. What began as an improvised field modification would soon evolve into a powerful new tactic, one that brought fire and steel together in one devastating package. Seeing how vulnerable infantrymen were while using portable flamethrowers, one forward-thinking officer proposed a bold solution. Install a flamethrower inside the turret of an M3A1 Stuart light tank and fire it through one of the small pistol ports. The idea might have sounded far-fetched at first, but in the chaos of the Pacific War, necessity often gave birth to unconventional innovation. Though the records don't confirm the officer's name, various sources credit Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hart, the battalion commander, as the likely originator of the concept. It was a risky, improvised approach, born out of sheer urgency, but it made complete sense. A tank had the ability to get close to fortified enemy positions while shielding its crew from enemy fire, something a foot soldier carrying a flamethrower on his back could never hope to achieve. The Japanese defenders were skilled at using concealment, bunkers, and caves to their advantage, and getting close enough to flush them out was often a death sentence for exposed flame troopers. But once the concept was put into practice, the flaws became immediately obvious. The M3A1 Stuart was a small tank by any standard, and its interior was extremely cramped. Even fitting two crewmen inside was already a tight squeeze, so trying to insert a full-length flamethrower into that limited space was nearly impossible. The crew had to deal with intense heat, confined movement, and the constant risk that the fuel tanks inside their own vehicle could ignite if hit. Yet despite all this, the idea remained compelling. The raw need for such a weapon outweighed its design shortcomings. The fierce fighting on New Georgia in July 1943 served as a brutal reminder of the kind of enemy the Americans were up against. Japanese troops dug deep into solid ground, shielded by fortifications, determined to resist until the last man. Portable flamethrowers helped, but only when operators managed to survive long enough to get close. The terrain demanded a new solution, a protected delivery system for firepower that could reach into the hidden bunkers and trench lines without exposing the soldier. The tank-mounted flamethrower seemed to be that answer. A demonstration was held near Noumea to showcase the new weapon. American, Australian, and New Zealand officers stood by, inspecting the tank closely. They understood the stakes. The upcoming landings on Bougainville were set for November 1st, and these flamethrower tanks were expected to take on the worst of the Japanese defenses. Time was slipping away, and expectations were high. But the reality of field deployment proved more complex than anyone had hoped. Despite the pressure to deliver results quickly, the tanks were not operational in time for the initial landings. It wasn't until January 1944, during the American effort to expand their beachhead, that the weapon was finally put into combat. By then, the 754th Tank Battalion had been fighting in the Pacific for nearly 2 years. Initially formed as a light tank unit, it had grown into something far more dangerous and aggressive. Now, under the leadership of Major Reino Lehtinen, the battalion brought a new kind of warfare to Bougainville, one that didn't rely solely on firepower, but on psychological shock and sheer destructive force. These new tanks didn't just fire bullets, they unleashed fire itself, a weapon both feared and despised. On January 30th, 1944, the Americans launched an assault on a heavily fortified Japanese position ominously nicknamed the Hornet's Nest. It would be the first real battlefield test for the new flamethrower tanks. The Japanese had built a dense network of defensive bunkers on the edge of the American beachhead near Empress Augusta Bay. Constructed with heavy logs and designed to withstand direct hits, these fortifications were held by troops of the 2nd Battalion, 4th South Seas Garrison. Their defensive line stretched hundreds of yards, from the Torokina River eastward to the village of Mavavia. This formation created a solid wall that posed a serious threat to any attempt by the Americans to move inland or secure control of the coastline. Initial efforts to dislodge the Japanese with conventional infantry tactics were met with punishing resistance. The 132nd Infantry Regiment, sent in to probe and push through the defenses, faced withering fire. Flamethrowers carried by foot soldiers did work, but only when they could be used from dangerously close range. The Japanese defenders knew this, and they focused their fire on any trooper carrying the fuel tanks, treating them as high-priority targets. The carnage was severe. It became painfully clear that new tools were needed if the Americans hoped to break through this line without suffering catastrophic losses. The flamethrower tank, despite all its improvised features and flaws, was the answer to that problem. It provided not just protection for the crew, but also the kind of penetrating force that could defeat deeply embedded enemies. The moment fire was unleashed into the Hornet's Nest, the battle began to shift. Fire had the unique ability to go where bullets couldn't, into cracks, behind cover, down into bunkers. It terrified the enemy. The psychological effect of a tank roaring forward, spraying liquid fire that no trench or sandbag could stop, broke the will of even the most fanatical defenders. There was no hiding from it, no defense against it once it was close. In hindsight, the invention of the flamethrower tank might seem crude and brutal, but it was undeniably effective in a war where terrain, fortification, and fanatic resistance made conventional approaches nearly useless. It was a harsh solution to an even harsher problem. The men who drove those tanks and carried those weapons paid a heavy price for their innovation, often risking their lives inside machines packed with fuel, fighting enemies who saw them as the most dangerous men on the battlefield. But in places like the Hornet's Nest, their weapon made all the difference. General John Hodge, who commanded the American division, deployed units from the 754th Tank Battalion, which included M3A1 Stuart light tanks and several outfitted with flamethrowers. At 7:45 in the morning, the 82nd Chemical Mortar Battalion began firing smoke rounds to obscure the battlefield, soon followed by 81mm mortars and supporting artillery fire. By 8:30, Company C of the 132nd Infantry began its advance behind a line of tanks, with skirmishers out front and demolition teams close behind, prepared to finish any job the tanks started. Tragically, the first serious loss came not from enemy fire, but from an accident. Just after 9 a.m., American artillery mistakenly struck one of the leading tanks. The Stuart went up in flames almost instantly, killing its commander, Sergeant Minor J. Hall, and leaving 2 other crew members badly injured. Corporal Joe Simon managed to escape the burning vehicle, but he was fatally shot while trying to rescue his fellow soldiers. His bravery earned him a posthumous Silver Star. The flamethrower tanks were making a significant impact as they led the push against the Japanese fortifications. Their ability to reach into bunkers with fire made them invaluable. However, even with added armor to protect the crew, these vehicles were far from invulnerable. During one assault, a tank armed with an M3A1 flamethrower targeted a fortified enemy position that was pinning down American troops. The operator succeeded in spraying fuel into the bunker, but the weapon's ignition system failed at a critical moment. Facing immediate danger, and with no time to troubleshoot, the crewman threw open his hatch and hurled a thermite grenade into the fuel-soaked target while under intense enemy fire. A blinding flash followed as the fuel ignited, consuming the bunker in flames and wiping out the defenders in a single fiery blast. At 10:30 a.m., the Japanese responded with a sudden counteroffensive, using Molotov cocktails and concentrated mortar fire aimed at the tanks. This attack claimed the lives of 2nd Lieutenant John White and Sergeant James Jarman. Once again, Staff Sergeant Drowley showed incredible courage. He spotted a concealed Japanese machine gun nest that had been missed by both the tanks and infantry and was causing severe casualties. Without hesitation, he ran through a hail of gunfire to the nearest flame tank, climbed onto its hull, and beat on the turret with his rifle, urgently pointing to the hidden threat. The tank fired its weapon, but in the confusion of battle and due to limited visibility inside, it missed the target. Wounded but undeterred, Drowley grabbed a submachine gun loaded with tracer rounds. Even after taking bullets to the chest and face, he used the glowing rounds to mark the exact location of the enemy position for the tank crew. Thanks to his quick thinking and determination, the tank was able to correct its aim and blanket the area with fire, completely destroying the nest. Bleeding heavily and partially blinded, Drowley still refused medical evacuation until he was sure the enemy had been neutralized. For his extraordinary valor, he received the Medal of Honor, presented to him personally by President Franklin D. Roosevelt. By early afternoon, the flamethrower tanks were forced to retreat temporarily to resupply. Each blast of flame lasted less than 20 seconds, and their fuel and pressure systems needed replenishing. At 1:30 p.m., 5 Stuart tanks returned to the battlefield and resumed the offensive. Working closely with infantry units, they set fire to and destroyed 28 Japanese bunkers, with flamethrower tanks directly credited for 14 of those kills. The remaining positions were eliminated using a mix of portable flamethrowers, small arms fire, and mortar rounds. The battle for the Hornet's Nest marked a key moment in the development of American armored tactics in the Pacific. It showed how powerful and effective tanks armed with flamethrowers could be when used correctly. By the middle of 1944, specially designed flamethrower tanks, nicknamed Satan, were entering combat just in time for major operations on islands like Saipan and Guam, where volcanic rock and coral made enemy fortifications even tougher. What started as a quick solution on Bougainville had transformed into a formal part of American military strategy. The harsh, unforgiving jungle had tested the partnership between fire-spewing tanks and determined infantry. Through trial, adaptation, and immense bravery, they had earned their place at the heart of the Pacific Campaign.